Is there sin in heaven? We define sin as it is defined from the Christian faith and from the Bible, a crime against God. Not necessarily a crime against another human being, but against God himself. So can any of the sin that we are cursed with here on earth, according to Christianity, be allowed to happen in heaven? This is part 2 in a series of videos where I'm trying to conclude as to whether Christianity is the truth, and based on that truth, can we logically assume the existence of God? In part 1, I visited the fear of hell I had as I was growing up, and the absurdity of the great flood of Noah, and how I began the quest to find the truth. And in this video, I plan to cover other various objections and questions to the doctrine of Christianity, and I may not spend a great deal of time on each individual argument and more time on some versus others, but obviously, if you'd like more discussion on one topic, please comment below and let me know, and I'll do my best to revisit that in a future video. According to the Bible, Lucifer, aka the devil, Satan, the dark one, the prince of deception, etc., used to be one of the most beautiful angels in heaven. In fact, he was supposed to have been God's right-hand man. Beautiful, powerful, next to God. But that wasn't good enough for Lucifer. He wanted to be God. He wanted to be the all-powerful one. So, to achieve this, he rebelled against God. He sinned. He took a third of the angels with him. And as a consequence, he was cast out of heaven. However, this implies something contrary to the description that we all know of heaven from what we've been taught as Christians, specifically the allowance of sin in heaven. If Lucifer was able to rebel and sin against God while in heaven, doesn't that subsequently lead us to the conclusion that God cannot prevent sin in heaven? Isn't that a logical conclusion? Think about the consequences of this. If God is unable to prevent sin, he is not omnipotent. It would also sort of explain why we have sin in this world. Perhaps God had the power to create perfection, but not to keep it perfect. He could not keep Adam and Eve from sinning. I logically reached that conclusion based on knowing that Lucifer sinned within the realm of heaven without prevention, meaning he had free will in heaven, right? Well, then what makes heaven any better than the world we currently live in? Isn't heaven described as a place with no sorrow, no sadness, no pain, no suffering? However, if sin can happen there, and if sin is the root of all the suffering of a quote-unquote fallen world, it would lead me to conclude it's not necessarily a better place. What do you guys think? Leave your comments below on that argument. Also, if hell didn't exist prior to Lucifer's rebellion, God must have created it specifically for Lucifer and his followers. Correct? Or does Lucifer also have the power to create things from nothing himself? In the first conclusion, it means God did create hell, which is disturbing to me. It's a disturbing prospect. Why would he create a place of punishment and torture to put those that rebel against him, yet doesn't have the power to prevent that rebellion or that sin? In other words, if he's omniscient, meaning that he knows everything, both past, present, and future, he already knew that Lucifer would sin. He already knew mankind would sin, yet he created all of it anyway. If he already knew that the sin would occur and that he would need to create a place of torture and punishment to place those that sinned against him, why bother creating them to begin with? That's like saying he just created it because he wanted to torture people. I mean, it's essentially creating them to send them to torture and punishment, right? If he already knew, if he's omniscient. This, of course, is based on the fact that God is attributed to omniscience as well as omnipotence. What do you think? And we'll move on a little bit to the story of Jesus. The basic premise is that between Noah's flood and the time of Jesus' birth, God saw that the world had once again become evil and sinful, so instead of destroying the planet again and essentially murdering all of humanity as he did in the flood, he came up with a loophole. Because we are all born into this curse, into sin, we cannot save ourselves. We are doomed to eternal torture and punishment for this sin. So God decided to become a man himself, have himself killed in a heinous way, crucifixion, and essentially take the punishment for us so that we could be forgiven and not have to suffer eternal suffering and torture. It's a nice story, and on the surface it sounds like the ultimate sacrifice. However, if you delve deeper into the rationality of the story, it raises many more questions than it provides answers to. First of all, why are we, as human beings, doomed to an eternal and infinite amount of torture and punishment in the first place? The Christian answer? Well, because we are all suffering the effects of the curse of the original sin of Adam and Eve's corruption in the Garden of Eden. However, think about that premise alone. To use an analogy, let's suppose you have 4 children spaced out over a number of years. And when your firstborn child was still young and before any of his or her siblings were born, he or she did something wrong. The crime really isn't that important. Just the fact that something wrong was done. Okay? Now, when your second child is born, your third child, your fourth child, and so on, would you see it rational to continue punishing those children for the quote-unquote crime of the first child? And not just a one-time punishment, but a continued punishment over and over and over again. That's crazy, wouldn't you say? Well, that's essentially what Christianity teaches us that God did. And God, being an infinitely more supreme being than ourselves, couldn't come up with a better plan. We're born and we're already guilty. That's what it teaches. Imagine having to tell your child as they grow old enough to even understand and comprehend that they're guilty already. They're doomed to an eternity of fire, hell, and damnation just for being born. None of us would do that, would we? I know I wouldn't. It would be cruel beyond cruel to tell a child that. But yet, if you were raised as a Christian, that's exactly what you were taught to believe. I know I was, from a very young, early age. And on top of that insanity, God sent his only son, which really wasn't his son because it was himself as a man, to be tortured and killed instead of us. But our punishment isn't the same as what Jesus suffered. If all our punishment consisted of was being crucified and coming back to life 3 days later, I mean, not that that would be a good punishment or anything, but it's not nearly as bad as eternal damnation. That was a finite punishment. So how is it one and the same? How did Jesus pay for our crimes by dying and coming back to life? And since Jesus was God, he already knew that he would come back to life in 3 days, so how is that really a sacrifice at all? Besides, God is the one that makes the rules to all this to begin with, right? Why did there need to be a blood sacrifice in the first place? You're going to tell me that God, the most powerful being ever, was incapable of forgiving his children, his creation, without becoming a man and dying as a bloody sacrifice? That's the best he could come up with? What if our justice system here in America worked like this? If someone was charged with rape, for example, but instead of that person going to prison for their crime, someone else steps in and takes the punishment? Would we consider that just? Would we consider that as being righteous? I wouldn't. It happens, though. I mean, innocent people are sent to prison all the time, unfortunately. We should all be accountable for our own actions. Christianity allows a loophole for that. If you're a good person, live your life treating others with dignity and respect, helping others out, helping those in need, essentially not violating anyone else's rights as much as humanly possible. You know, being a good person overall, moral as much as you can. I mean, I know we're not perfect, but at the same time, you don't believe in any deity of God or Jesus as described in the Bible. According to the doctrine of Christianity, you will die and go straight to hell, an eternal hell. No second chance, no justice, no chance to be rewarded for your goodness, but instead immediate and eternal suffering for the crime of not believing. And on the contrary, an evil human being, we know who they are, a person that spends his life lying, cheating, stealing, murdering, raping, everything we consider immoral and evil, yet confesses his sins, repents right before his death, and according to Christianity, he would be quote-unquote saved, and he'd go to heaven, right? Is that justice? Do you see the problem here? It's no justice whatsoever. There's no accountability. Some say God is the ultimate judge and is ultimately just, but they also say that God is merciful. But the very definition of mercy is a suspension of justice. You cannot be just and be merciful simultaneously. It's not logical. So either we are accountable for our own actions or we're not. In my second example, that would be mercy, not justice. In my first example, that would be far from justice or mercy. Are we to believe that God is such a superior being, more so than ourselves, that his plan is somehow good and we just can't understand or see it? If that's the case, why would he have created us to be so inferior? Wouldn't he have wanted us to see his goodness? And why is God so hidden from reality, hidden from the world? A lot of believers put forth the argument that if God were to reveal his existence, it would affect our free will. How so? Whether we actually have free will to begin with is debatable, but that's another topic for another video. But say for this example, we definitely do have free will, for the sake of argument. How is God revealing himself going to affect that free will? Would we not still be able to reject worshiping and or following God by our own free will if we knew for sure he existed? Sure we would. Most Christians that believe in God also believe in Satan, and Satan definitively knows that God exists, yet he still uses his free will to rebel, right? And that's at least one example that destroys that free will excuse, so God could easily reveal himself to the world without necessarily affecting our supposed free will. I was a Christian nearly all of my life. I know what it's like to be a believer, to have that value in belief, even if you have doubts. And I always had doubts. I always had questions, but never went this deep into the questioning because I felt it was some kind of sin to even question or doubt the doctrine. But I had to let go of that premise before I could try to truly research it and think about it critically. And I think the thing that allowed me to let go of that well-ingrained belief was the fact that I couldn't get my mind around the infinite punishment for a finite crime, if you want to call it a crime. I can't imagine a superior being equating that to justice. I mean, it equates to getting a life sentence or a death sentence for jaywalking. And that's actually probably a rather conservative example. Spending an eternity, a never-ending eternity in hell, fire, torture, suffering, and damnation for that crime of not having enough evidence to believe in God, let alone the rationale to accept the doctrine of Christianity as a whole. That's the big problem I had, and thus what led me to get to where I'm at now. Another argument against Christianity is the moral argument. Is the belief, the faith, even moral to begin with? And that our morals come from God and from the Bible. I'll explore that more in part 3 of this series, but it's also a compelling argument, and the believers do have some interesting and valid points as well. I am not completely opposed to the idea of God. That is not the case at all. I would like to believe that a loving God and a loving deity that cares about all of his creation exists, and that there is more life after physical death. But there currently resides no proof or evidence of such, and using the Bible to reach that conclusion just leads you down the rabbit hole of objections to Christianity, and that's where I'm at. So as a whole, I'm not rejecting God or rejecting Jesus or anything like that, as some have accused me of. Aside from a lack of evidence of the supernatural as a whole, I suppose I am rejecting the doctrine of the Christian faith. Why? Well, I've just touched on a few of those arguments and rejections, and there's a ton more. Am I to just blindly follow what doesn't make rational and logical sense to me? Am I to blindly follow something that I morally disagree with? We don't rationally decide on what we believe anyway. I cannot consciously decide to continue believing in the story if I have overwhelming evidence to the contrary. It's not something we decide to do. We don't decide to believe in gravity or decide to believe in physics. The proof is right in front of us. More coming up in part 3 in this series on my journey away from Christianity. I do hope you will check that video out too when I get it posted here in the near future. Until then, please check out my Patreon page, patreon.com/Andy Michaels. Become a patron. I don't have one yet. I'm still waiting on my first patron. Even if it's just $1, anything helps. Anything is appreciated. Trust me. So head on over there, become a patron, comment. I do invite you to comment. I encourage you to comment and subscribe to my channel and check out the rest of my videos and check out part 3 when it comes up. Until then, have a great one.